Hello students, I'm going to start off by talking about 4 or 5 additions to the module called Visual Communication in the News. And then I will attach this video to one that I had made previously, which goes through Module 7 and explains everything that is in that module. So the first one is that Tinder has made a request to the body that's in charge of emojis, asking for interracial couple emojis, because they say that that's one of the things that it is impossible to sort of communicate visually given the current set of emojis, and that is sort of disserving those couples who are in fact interracial. There's a fascinating piece. It's called AI Wants to Know How You Plan Your Vacation, and it has to do with the company Expedia, and they are doing some research with sort of facial analysis of people as they're online planning a trip. And so if you see a motel room and then you make a face that's like, ooh, I don't like that motel room, etc. Expedia is going to be able to read your facial expressions as you are planning your trip, and that could help them provide a better experience for you. They will learn things about you because of your sort of body language. And one of the things about body language is that it can often be truer than what comes out of your mouth because it is unconscious. So they will learn things about you as you are looking at various sort of hotel and motel accommodations. Um, let's see. The next one is I tried to make my dog an Instagram star. This is actually from back in December, and I had put it aside and forgot that I wanted to load it in here. So a person who is a tech writer for the New York Times figured it would be pretty easy for him to make his pug a star of Instagram, and it turns out that it was not at all easy. He says one of the things is Instagram is incredibly competitive, and so I think that'll be of interest to several of you. Um, there is a story about a group of legislators I believe it's in Connecticut, who are discussing a gun control bill. And these these Republican male legislators, were wearing strings of pearls as they were discussing this topic. And that caused some gun control advocates to become sort of enraged at this behavior. And so to understand what is going on there, you would really have to read the article, and you would probably actually have to think about what you learned from Roland Barthes about images and how they communicate. But it was taken by the gun control advocates as a sign of disrespect to the group. And it was Moms for whatever it is, Moms for reasonable drug gun control laws. So that these Republican male legislators were sort of dismissing them by wearing these strings of pearls. And then, let's see, Jenna Wortham is a person who has a byline in the New York Times. She writes for the New York Times Magazine, and there's an article about her and her what it's like for a woman of color to be writing a social media for a mainstream publication. And so several of these have to do with this notion of affordances. Now, I've commented in several of your visual affordances of social media logs. There's a couple that I haven't yet gotten to, but I'll put it in there. And so what I just want to remind you, you're all noticing some interesting things. I want to remind you to focus on the affordances as you're looking at somebody else's social media or your own social media. What does it afford you, the viewer, to see? What do you get to see? And what does it afford you, the producer, the publisher of social media? What does it allow you to show? Because it really is about seeing and being seen, and sort of give some thought to how that stuff works. So, oh, and then there's also one more that I added in there, and this is from a year ago, and it was a very disturbing account in the New York Times. So you know by now how easy it can be to fake a photograph. Some of you did some very convincing jobs of putting yourself into situations where you were not actually there and couldn't have been there. And so That's easy enough in a still photograph, and it turns out now you can do that in video too. So there was a very disturbing story a year ago about how easy it is now for someone to take a video and put somebody else's face on somebody else's body. And the particular example was that somebody had used this, readily available, inexpensive software, downloaded it, and then put Michelle Obama's face on the body of a woman in a pornographic video. And so this has some very disturbing consequences for, what will we believe? What will we know? It used to be seeing is believing, and now it is clearly the case where seeing is not necessarily believing. So I'm going to pack this up now and then attach it to a video that I made last year, which is an introduction to the various parts of the module for module number 7. And so then tomorrow is Monday, March 11th. The following Monday, March 18th, is spring break for those classes that meet face-to-face. And so in this materials that you will see starting as soon as I open the module, there is the assignment for your midterm visual analysis essay. And so you've actually got a couple of weeks to do that, because I won't be asking you to publish it by, say, next week, Monday the 18th, and I might put some stuff up, but very little. I'm not going to expect you to be doing a lot of work over spring break. You may have some other plans, and so that midterm visual analysis essay is going to be due on Sunday the 24th for the what will be module number 8 starting on March 25th. And then also I created once again a discussion board, hoping that those of you who created your visual design project number 2, that you might be willing to share that there. It's optional. So if you didn't like the result, or if you don't want to share it, that's fine. But if you're if you're willing to do that, please do that, because I think it'll be of interest to some of your classmates. And so again, some of you use Photoshop to do that, and then you load it as a Photoshop document, and then I could download that because I have Photoshop, but not everybody does. So if you create it in Photoshop, if you export it, I think it's a quick export as a PNG. It just takes an instant, and then what you have is an image that anybody can see. So if you're going to share your Photoshop, if you're going to share your believable, impossible, aspirational self-portrait, do so in the form that anybody could open as either a PNG or a GIF or a JPEG. Okay, so soon there will be the second part of this video attached to this front part. Talk to you later. So what I'm going to do right now is just go through the agenda for this week, tell you about some things, and then explain some of the readings that we've already had, and give you a preview of some of the things you're going to be looking at in the module, and then end up by talking about the midterm visual analysis essay. All right. The other piece of visual communication in the news, I've actually loaded in as the last page in the module for week 7, and it is from this week's New York Times Magazine, and it's called The Business of Color, and it's about a company by the name of Pantone, and Pantone has sort of cornered the market on, okay, if you have a certain blue, cerulean blue, they will give it a name and a number, and that way people who make paint for your home, or people who make fabric for your curtains, or people who make upholstery for your car can all be in agreement on what a certain color is. It'll have a name, it'll have a number, and Pantone are the people sort of in charge of designating those things. And so in that page on the module and in the article itself, there was a pointer to a scene. If some of you saw The Devil Wears Prada, there's a scene in which Meryl Streep's character basically takes Anne Hathaway's character to task for having laughed at the fact that she couldn't tell the difference between two color blues. And Meryl Streep ends up kind of giving her quite a dressing down and saying that, she thinks she chose the blue sweater that she happens to be wearing, but in fact, it was chosen by people in the room who make those kind of decisions. So it's a fairly interesting article about the business of color. So discuss the Oswald and Levy readings. So the Oswald reading, I thought, was a pretty good job of sort of applying some of these more esoteric theories. When you're reading them as written by the French philosopher and semiotician Roland Barthes, it gets pretty wiggy pretty quickly. But Oswald, after the introduction, and some of that was stuff I said you didn't have to read certain pages because we already covered that almost in the first week when we were talking about Saussurean linguistics versus Peircean linguistics. But one of the things that keeps coming up is this notion of structuralism. And so Oswald has a couple of charts, and here I have them in the hard copy, but when I'm done recording this, I will actually bring in linkages to these sort of structuralist diagrams. You could call them semiotic squares. And they rely on the idea that there are all these opposites. So we have male and we have female, we have power, we have powerless, we have mature versus trendy, we have individualistic versus social. So these different concepts that are in these diagrams are ones that can help people talk about an image and what it is communicating. So again, we're back to that idea that we communicate with words. Images have this tremendous power to communicate, but our ability to talk about images depends upon some agreement, linguistic terms, theoretical terms. So Oswald does, I think, a pretty good job of applying this semiotics to a couple case studies. So she's got the case study of McDonald's and how they were hurting at one point because they were losing market share, and part of it had to do with the fact that they seemed to not take seriously a very large segment of the market, which were the women, and so they did some semiotic analysis and came up with some advertising that was sort of more appealing and friendly to women. And then we had compact computer that ended up failing. And so I thought that the Oswald essay, if nothing else, she did a good job of applying semiotics to a couple of cases, and particularly used some of the tools to talk about images that were in there. And then the Levy reading, I thought that was really charming, particularly because if you look at it, that doesn't look like the Harvard Business Review of today because it's from the 50s, but the clip art in it made it quite almost silly. And so, but he had some really good points. Oswald says that Levy basically is the one who introduced the idea that advertising and consumer branding is working in symbols. And so before this, people hadn't thought much about it. So even though Levy doesn't use any of the new technical jargon of semiotics, he really was saying that what we have are symbols for sale. And if you think of, you say, well, how symbolic is all this stuff? Imagine you have a teenager who would like a pair of Air Jordans and they would like an iPhone, and instead what you deliver to them are sort of the, brand, Sears brand name sneakers and some, sort of old Nokia phone. They would be, just heartbroken at how you had sort of not met their expectations, because it's not the actual sneaker or the phone itself so much as what Air Jordans symbolize and what an iPhone symbolizes. And so these and other brands have succeeded very well in selling people these ideas that are really about their identity. Okay? So what you're going to find in the module for week 7 is a lot of stuff on logo and brand design. And so most of this is stuff that you'll be reading or viewing inside of Canvas. Initially, there's some theory about how logos work. There's some pretty nice examples of logos for the National Hockey League. And if you look at those and see the ones that are considered the best and the worst, you'll probably get a sense of, why is it that these old style ones are really regarded as the best, and why is it some of the new ones are really the worst. But in addition, you will find an article that talks about, what makes a good logo, what should it do. We have also a short video about Google. When Google redid its logo, a lot of people were sort of appalled by that because they like the old logo. And so people do not respond well to change, but there's some interesting commentary on, there's both a video by Google about the new logo, and then there's a article about people's resistance to the new logo. And then there's also a page on the evolution of the Starbucks logo. The Starbucks logo has changed 4 or 5 times already since the firm was founded. It's not that old. And so there are reasons behind the logo. And one of the things that the Starbucks logo that other logos are doing is becoming more pictorial, and they have fewer words. And so this is a trend which seems to be, all logos seem to be going in that direction. There's then a page about Chip Kidd, who is the premier book designer. If you were to go into a Barnes & Nobles and look at some of the biggest best-selling books that had, really sort of strongly attractive graphical covers, there's a good chance that Chip Kidd is the designer who designed some of those. So I have a link to the Chip Kidd site. I'd say look around in there because he's just a brilliant designer, and he's very entertaining. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. Then there's also a page from Milton Glaser, who is sort of one of the premier graphic designers of our time. If you've ever seen the I Love New York logo, that is his work. There's a famous sort of multicolor image of Bob Dylan that was an insert into a Dylan album from the 60s, etc. So Milton Glaser is just brilliant. Then there's also a page from Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein is a Canadian. She's a sort of a theorist. She's an educator. And so she has a book called No Logo. And so the gist of that is logos are not innocent, and logos are not necessarily your friends. And so it's quite a critique of the degree to which we are constantly bombarded with these logos. And so, we as mature adults, we can say, oh, fine, we can ignore it. We can do whatever we want. When you think of the impact on young people and the way they are then sort of exhorted to own this and buy that and have the best one and the most expensive one. So Naomi Klein has some fairly strong opinions on the harmful and negative aspects of the way logos have pervaded our society. And then we've got the Olympic pictograms through the ages. And that one is Heller is his name, and he is sort of one of the premier graphic designers of all time. And so that's a short little video which is quite entertaining and will communicate quite a bit in a short period. Okay. So let me see if this. Oh, also, Levy mentions the Spring Made ad, the Clabber Girl, and the Pepsi Girl. And so one of the things he says is suggests that the average consumer might miss or ignore the humor in a Spring Made sheet advertisement. And so this is a copy of such an ad. You could say, well, it's humorous. You could also say it's sexist, it's racist. So it may not be deemed as humorous today as it was in the 50s, but at the time there was sort of a message there. And so then there's the example of the sort of Clabber Girl as an example of an outdated symbol. And then we have the more current Pepsi Girl, but this is the Pepsi Girl from the 50s. So those are kind of interesting. There's a whole thing on logo and brand design that includes Hillary Clinton's logo in her 2016 campaign, the original Trump-Pence logo, which was then revised because people made a sort of scandalous animated GIF of it, and so they switched to a different logo. Then we've got the NHL logos. Google's new logo. The Starbucks, so there are 4 different Starbucks. So from 1971, when it said Starbucks Coffee, Tea, and Spices, to the present one, which I'm not sure when the present one was launched, but that one now has no words. So it went with more words to fewer words to no words, and theirs is not the only logo that has gone in that direction. We've got Chip Kidd, we've got Milton Glaser, we've got no logo, pictograms. All right, and And then now we get to the assignment, so the midterm essay assignment. There is a page for Paul Martin Lester's sixth perspective. If you'll think back to the first class meeting, and we talked about different approaches, there was Gestalt, etc. And one was the Lester-Huxley model. And it's called that because Paul Martin Lester, a current faculty member in California who teaches visual communication, is a great believer in some of the things that Huxley said about images, including the more you know, the more you see. So Paul Martin Lester's book is called Visual Communication, Images with Messages. And so what I have done is I've uploaded one chapter of this book, and it is section 4, the media through which we see. And what it does is it introduces Paul Martin Lester's six perspectives, and they are personal, historical, technical, ethical, cultural, and critical. And so you should read that article, read that chapter. It's not long, it's pretty straightforward, because when you look at the midterm image analysis assignment, you will see that you have the option of picking any number of the theoretical approaches that we've covered so far. Most people, for the past 3 times that I've taught this course, have chosen Paul Martin Lester's six perspectives because it is very easy to apply. And so I'd say, by all means, choose that if you want. If you'd rather choose Gestalt approach, you can do that. If you remember that 35-slide PowerPoint, how pictures worked, that is basically a pictorial representation of the Gestalt approach. So you could do a Gestalt analysis. You could try to do something with Roland Barthes' semiotic analysis of an image. The assignment specifies that the image that you pick, and you can pick anything. You can pick an ad, and as Barthes said, one of the advantages of picking an ad, there's no ambiguity as to what the advertiser was trying to do. They're at least trying to get you to know what they sold and think positively of their product in some way. So you could pick an ad, but you could pick a work of fine art. You could pick a painting. You could pick a work of your own art. You could pick some graffiti that's on a wall somewhere. So there's no restrictions. Or that whole collection of images, when we had the first shot in analyzing an image, you looked at a whole collection of what are news photographs from the New York Times, and it was the year in pictures. So you pick any image that you want and then analyze it using some theory that you would like to apply to it. But if the image has any words, then you need to also address the words, and this is specified in the details on the images on the assignment. So there you could choose to either use Barthes' approach to the way words often serve as anchorage for an image, or you could use either of the Lupton and Miller essays that are talking about typography and words, or you could use the Goodhart-Wilcox chapter, which talks about text, etc. But if there are words in the image you're analyzing, you need to somehow address them. And then there's a note in the Paul Martin Lester six perspectives. What he does is, one of his perspectives is ethical. Well, when he goes into the ethical perspective, then he branches into 6 different sort of ethical approaches. You don't need to try and get each one of the 6 ethical approaches to talk to your image, because in some cases it would just not be appropriate. So you might choose to just have one ethical approach if you're using the Lester six perspectives. And then what I have on the page after that, I think, is a sample that I did myself. So I took an image. It was an image that was actually on a music CD, but I knew that before it was on that music CD, it came from the 60s, and it came from the circumstances when the United States was involved in the Vietnam War. And so you can read my image essay analysis, and what I'm doing there is I am using Paul Martin Lester's 6 perspectives. So I think that wraps it up for what I'm going to be saying here about this upcoming week.